Hi, it's me, Olivia. Welcome to my channel. Please subscribe to my channel for interesting stories and visit my Patreon page for early access, link in the description. Thanks. Julia was standing beside me. She would do something with her hair or flutter her hand, or something each time Leonidas looked our way to ensure that she had his attention. It was distracting to me standing beside her and clearly interesting to Leonidas. What, he said, recognizing too late that Queen Seloi had spoken. What is your decision, Prince Leonidas? She repeated. Oh, decision, yes, he stammered. This one, Samuel, has stolen the other's ram. Samuel is a thief. Kill him. Samuel collapsed on the spot, blubbering incoherently for mercy. Harris looked almost as stricken. He hadn't wanted vengeance, only the price of his ram. Most of the rest of us were horrified as well. Only Queen Seloi remained calm. She waited for Samuel's wails to die down, then addressed Leonidas. Very well, Regent. Shall we execute Samuel's wife and children as well? Without him, there is no way they will survive the winter. Or would you prefer that they starve? No, of course not. Let someone else take care of her, Leonidas replied. Now, we all knew that Samuel's wife was part of a large family and would not really starve. But Leonidas did not. Who do you recommend? The queen asked. Leonidas was getting a bit flustered. I don't know. Doesn't she have any family? Does it appear to you that Samuel is prosperous, part of a wealthy family? The queen's interrogation continued, though it was the regent who was now on trial. Leonidas studied the men before him. Neither were dressed in the clothes of the nobility, but even between them it was clear that Samuel's clothes were of lesser quality than those Harris wore. I could see Leonidas trying to find another option. Mother's question had two thrusts in it. If Samuel's family couldn't support his wife, then surely Samuel couldn't pay restitution for the ram, either. A moment of vulnerability showed in Leonidas' dark eyes before he hardened his expression. If you have a better idea, tell it to me. Now the challenge was back on the queen, but her tight smile showed it was expected. She had not actually answered any of Leonidas' questions, replying instead with questions of her own. She paid no more apparent attention to his order. Looking at Harris while pointing at Samuel, she asked, Do you desire this man's death? No, Your Majesty. The ram was not worth a man's life. What do you think would be fair? She asked. At this, Leonidas twitched as though bitten by a flea. Such an obvious question, and he didn't think to ask it. Harris was a little surprised as well. He looked at the man trembling at his feet for a moment, then answered, Perhaps if Samuel gave me the lambs which issue from the ewes fertilized by my ram. I'm afraid that's not good enough, Queen Seloi declared. He will indeed give you the lambs. In addition, he will labor for you on further improvements to your farm. His sentence will continue until he uses the skills he will learn in working for you to make similar improvements in his own farm. If he fails to apply himself, you will report back to us. Now her voice took on a harder tone. Do you understand and accept this judgment, Samuel? For one who had a moment ago faced execution, the sentence seemed light indeed. Samuel got to his feet with nodding acceptance, looking sideways at the neighbor who now had control of his life. Before they could turn away, Queen Seloi's voice froze them as she addressed Leonidas. If, that is, this judgment is acceptable to the regent? Leonidas could only nod at the obvious justice. He looked up as the next couple of peasants approached the dais and sighed at the thought of another interminable trial. Queen Seloi, as I have just arrived, I would like to get settled into my accommodations. I'll leave you to hear the remaining petitions. She nodded gravely, as you wish. Perhaps you would like an escort. Princess Charisse, please accompany him. I stepped forward in reflex to her order, but in confusion as well. I thought we were not going to encourage Leonidas in his pursuit of me. He held out his arm in easy courtesy, and my hand took its place on his. We swept from the throne room with an overlarge escort of all the tan-garbed men, my own guards, and Julia. I don't believe I have met your companion, Leonidas stated once our circus had gotten underway. This is my late brother Tamer's betrothed, Julia, I replied. Leonidas bowed to Julia. There was no apology in his voice, but he spoke with honest respect. Your betrothed was a valiant warrior of great courage and skill. It is history, she replied. Her eyes wandered up and down Leonida's lanky frame and implied it might as well have been ancient history. A few strands of hair, no longer contained by combs and pins, had drifted in front of my face, so I tossed my head to get it back behind my shoulder. It didn't all go where I wanted, so I gathered it in the hand not held by Leonidas and pulled it back. In the course of this, my bosom had pressed against his arm. Of course, since it wasn't really me, I didn't realize it immediately, and we walked along with my new curves rubbing softly against his much harder forearm. When my hair was out of the way, I looked up at him to find his own gaze focused rather intently on the interaction. Once I realized what had happened, I moved clear, but not before the smile on his face ignited a fire in my cheeks as bright as Julia's hair. Julia sniffed, then seemed to have trouble with her breathing, suddenly feeling the need to take several overlarge breaths. Her gown, unlike mine, displayed at least a part of attributes I only simulated, and the deep breathing captured my attention. I almost stumbled on an uneven place in the pavement, clutching at Leonida's hand for stability. For some reason, he had missed the same step. With that distraction, or perhaps release from distraction, I oriented on where we had gotten in our walk. The section ahead was normally reserved for nobility and a very few select companions, not the whole circus behind us. All but one of my guards drew up to their accustomed waiting area, but the swirl around Leonidas continued. I'm sorry, Prince Leonidas, but your guards are not permitted beyond this point. Is that so? He replied, suspicion in his eyes. Julia interrupted with a toss of her own hair. Surely, Prince Leonidas, you don't fear women and servants, do you? A grin lit his face at her comment, and his response was laden with undercurrents of humor. My dear mother has taught me that the female of the species is much deadlier than the male. That you can rely on, Julia laughed. I was about to make a comment of my own when Leonidas waved at his guards to take a position at the door, all but one that was indistinguishable from the rest, at least to me. Leonidas bowed me past the portal and held his genteel pose even as Julia entered behind me. Somehow, she managed to make her somber gown flippant and light as she passed. I had moved my own, of course, merely to stay clear of the doorway. It had been decided that Leonidas would stay in Tamer's rooms. Queen Celie intended to retain the royal apartments unless forcibly removed. I steered Leonidas to the correct wing with gentle pressures, and we arrived at our destination without letting it seem like there were any choices. Tamer's rooms were entirely befitting a crown prince, and Leonidas was clearly pleased. And where are your rooms? He asked me, a grin back in his eyes that made me feel most strange. Down the hall, I admitted, pointing vaguely. He asked Julia the same question. It was a good thing that mother had moved her to rooms adjacent to the royal suite, or Julia might have had a late-night visitor. Then I remembered that she had the same disincentive to dalliance that crushed my waist. Still, I didn't want her to be too available to Leonidas. Julia and I left Leonidas to get settled in his rooms. As we left, he was going around examining Tamer's martial mementos. It looked like he'd be quite satisfied with the decor. As soon as we were out of earshot, I turned to Julia. But her own words cut mine off before they were voiced. Charisse, you're not supposed to be encouraging him. Me? I'm not the one throwing myself at him. I shot back. You're not? Then what were you doing rubbing your bosom on his arm the whole way down the hall? That was an accident. I didn't even notice while I was fixing my hair, I claimed. That's another thing, flipping all the blonde hair around. Like his eyes weren't glued to you already. Well, at least I wasn't hyperventilating for effect. This brought a blush to her cheeks and enough pause in our ranting for another voice to intrude. Ladies, attend me please. Queen Celie's quiet voice left no room for other comment. She had apparently finished with the petitions and was returning to her room. We followed her with lowered heads, glaring at each other through the bright-colored tresses that framed our faces. We followed Mother into her rooms in silence, though. Once we were inside, Queen Celie moved quietly to her usual seat, motioning Julia and me to nearby stools. Girls, you're going to have to work together on this, she began. I interrupted her, but Mother, Julia was being shameless. I thought she was just supposed to keep Leonidas off balance so he didn't become too adamant about me too soon. Julia got her next comment in before Mother could reply, and that's all I was doing, trying to keep his interest from being totally focused on Charisse. But the way she was acting, that took some doing. That infernal maiden's lover kept me from gathering the breath I needed for the reply I wanted to make, and once again the slight pause gave Mother room to speak. "Quiet, both of you," she ordered. The glare Julia gave me was a sight to behold. Her green eyes had a fire in them that threatened to bring down the castle, fed by the blaze always shone in her tumbling hair now that she was forbidden to pin it up with maidenly modesty. Since we weren't allowed to speak, I tried to let her know with my own gaze that she wouldn't get between Leonidas and me. Mother sighed as she looked at us. After a moment, she spoke first to that red-headed tart. "Julia, Charisse's, struggling with her, reactions to this situation. Instead of berating her, you should help her find more appropriate responses. It is important that Leonidas be attracted to her, just not exclusively focused on her." I found myself sticking my tongue out at Julia at Mother's comments, though I couldn't remember the last time I had done that. Mother saw it, of course, and then it was my turn. "Charisse, you're above all a princess of Achaea. You will behave like a lady. However, the reason you are your maiden's lover is because I understand how difficult it is to maintain decorum. Nonetheless, you shall behave." "But Mother," I whined, "you asked me to escort him, and rubbing against him was an accident." Mother ignored Julia's snort and went on, "I asked you to escort him because we need to maintain his interest without letting it become overwhelming. It will be a delicate balance and will require great care. We cannot afford further accidents." She looked at us both, demanding obedience with her eyes. I looked at Julia, who looked at me, the challenge still in her eyes. Queen Celie cleared her throat in a manner that I had learned the hard way meant this was non-negotiable, so I looked back at my mother and nodded in submission. Julia followed suit, and I thought the incident was closed. "No such luck. Charisse," the queen ordered, "you will spend the balance of the day in your chambers. You are obviously overwrought by the stresses of our recent problems. Julia will be escorted by Leonidas this evening." My protest died on my lips at her stern look. This time it was Julia who stuck her tongue out at me. The unfairness of it was somewhat relieved by Mother's next command. "Julia, you will remember that your goal is to keep his interest, not win his love. That is for Charisse, but only when the time is right. I want you to be a model of propriety tonight." I could see Julia winding up for either protest or denial or something, but Mother's stern look forestalled her as well. She nodded once again. A thoughtful look appeared on the Queen's face as she looked at us. "Actually," she said, "this is probably for the best. A bit of jealousy between you will inflate Leonidas' already substantial ego and keep him from looking too closely at the things that will be happening. However, the two of you will remember your duty and keep yourselves under control. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mother," I replied, simultaneously with Julia's "Yes, my queen." Still, Julia was the one to go to the arrival dinner that evening. I spent it in my rooms with my music and my books and my one true friend, Wraith. The next morning I was summoned to Mother's chambers quite early. I wrapped a dressing gown around my always-present steel companion and went to her rooms without delay. I still wanted to find out why she had allowed Julia unrestricted access to that is, to Leonidas. I found Julia already in the room, also in a dressing gown. Mother was wearing much the same. She ushered us into her private bathing chamber, which was dominated by a quite large tub, already filled with steaming water and sprinkled with fresh rose petals. "All right, girls, this will be our normal practice from now on. You will bathe in my presence since it will require removal of your maiden's lovers. After that, I will replace them and you can get dressed for the day." I was so excited at the thought of getting out of my constricting tormentor that I didn't realize for a moment that Julia was part of the same plan. Instead, I whirled to present my back to Mother, dropping my dressing gown to allow her unrestricted access to the lock and flexible steel rod. I was not to be released immediately, though, since first Mother had to reattach the conventional lacing panels to relieve the pressure on the closures. It became even tighter, a feat I would have sworn was impossible, but then I heard the faint click of the lock being released and the slither of the rod withdrawing from the interlocking loops. Still, I had to stand there until she released the lacing panels as well, but with each inch of the flexible rod's withdrawal, my most intimate discomfort was relieved. I had become used to the sensation sufficiently to ignore it, but it had never been comfortable. Even the continuing constrictions at my waist paled to insignificance in comparison with the almost obscene pleasure of releasing the lower binding. Finally, even my waist was free, the silken undergarment also removed, and Mother was shooing me into the bath. I entered it gratefully, letting the heat soothe the many pinched points of my flesh, and most of all soothe the aching compression of those parts of me incongruous with my general appearance. I let my eyes close with pleasure and sank down until only my nose was clear of the perfumed water. A surge in the water roused me as I felt another body enter the tub. I looked up to see Julia, naked as a nymph and twice as lovely, slide with her own gratitude into the embracing warmth. In a single heartbeat, the dull ache I had been gently assuaging climbed to sharp need, causing me to gasp. "What's wrong?" Mother asked. Nothing really," I lied. Mother's eyes got shrewdly sharp for a moment, but she nodded acceptance of my words, if not their content. She handed me a bar of scented soap, and while I worked on the parts below the waterline, she began to work other soap into my blonde tresses. Once Julia's eyes opened from their own initial bliss, soap was handed to her as well, and she began her cleansing ritual. Her hair was as long as mine and perhaps even fuller, acting as a thick sponge to draw a mass of water from the bath. When the time came for Mother to wash Julia's hair, she raised herself up to rest her elbows on the edge of the tub. Please subscribe for the next part and visit my Patreon page for early access. Thanks.